Today we begin a new sermon series in the book of Genesis. So today's scripture passage will be Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters.
Thanks, Rachel. And as Rachel just said, and as you can tell from what Rachel just read, we are not in Philippians anymore. Finished our series in Philippians last week, and as John announced a few weeks ago, and as a whole bunch of you have let us know since then, really excited for this series that we're starting in the book of Genesis this morning. And John has talked about before, just man, as we start new books like this, how it's kind of like Christmas morning. Just the excitement and the anticipation. We've got this big old present I can't wait to tear into together this morning. And so I know I'm definitely feeling that this morning, and I hope it seems like from comments that you all have made that a lot of you are too. And my goal for this morning is that if you're not already excited and feeling that anticipation to dive into this book, that you'll feel that by the time that we're done this morning. And so I know Rachel just read chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 for us. And as much as I want to jump right into Genesis 1, we're not going to do that this morning. This is going to be a little different than what we normally do. Normally we just make our way through these books of the Bible, preach through section by section. But part of being able to preach the book of Genesis, we need to do a little bit of background work on it first. And so that's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to spend some time this morning preparing ourselves to study this book together over the weeks ahead by getting our bearings on what the book of Genesis is and why it was written, so that we're ready to hear what this book has to say to us as we begin it in the coming weeks. And so as we think about the book of Genesis, I want you to think just for a minute about a series of books that you've read maybe, or a series of TV shows or movies that you've watched that were just really well planned and really well written. One of those series that when you get to the end, everything just comes together and you realize that they were setting all this up all the way back from the very beginning. You know what I'm talking about? Like where the depth and the richness of how everything comes together in the end, and how that can only really be understood if you understand the beginning and if you pick up on the things that they introduced in the beginning. And then the more that you read or watch the beginning of the series, the better you understand and the more you pick up on and the more beauty you see in how everything comes together and fits together in the end. Well, the Bible is the ultimate well-planned, well-written story. And to be able to fully understand the rest of the Bible and pick up on the depth and the richness and the beauty and to see the threads woven through the rest of the story, how everything comes together in the end, like you have to understand the book of Genesis. And the better you understand the book of Genesis, the better you're going to understand the rest of the Bible. And the more beauty you'll pick up on, the more beauty you'll see in the rest of the Bible. And this matters because this story isn't just some fictional universe created for our entertainment. Like this is the universe that we live in. Like Genesis is actual history about real people and real things that really happened that matter for our lives today and how we live in this world and where we're headed and what will happen to us in the future. So it matters a lot that we understand Genesis. But there's at least a couple of things that potentially stand in the way of us understanding the book of Genesis. One of those would be our past experience with Genesis. That Genesis, that we grew up reading the book of Genesis, hearing these stories. And so even if you didn't grow up in church, you probably are familiar with a number of the stories in Genesis and some of the stories that we're going to come across. Like you probably have heard about Adam and Eve. maybe something about a talking snake, and maybe something about an apple. You maybe heard about Noah and the ark and the animals coming 2 by 2, the rainbow. Maybe Joseph and his coat of many colors. Maybe a few other stories in this book are going to be familiar to you as you go. And to some extent, that's great. Like, it's good to know these stories. But the danger is that we can think we know them and not actually know them as well as we think we do. And then thinking that we know them can actually keep us from hearing them for what they're actually saying. On top of that, like I said, the stories were taught to us as kids most of the time, and so we can almost think of them as children's stories, almost in the category of like fairy tales in our brain. And so, like, just think about Noah's Ark. Like, it can be really hard getting past thinking of it as like a Fisher-Price toddler toy, you know, like with those cute little plastic animals, or like a nice painting on a nursery room wall or something like that. Like that, a lot of times that's what we think of when we think of Noah's Ark, is that kind of picture. But what we're going to see is that we get there, like, these aren't kids' stories in that sense at all. And so, yeah, that's not what they are. The other thing about our past experience is that these stories are all probably somewhat like disconnected in our minds, right? Like, they were taught to us as separate stories, and each of them has their own story. And so we don't think of them as fitting together as part of a bigger story. And so our past experience in all those different ways can keep us from understanding Genesis. Also, our expectations can keep us from understanding Genesis as well. And here's what I mean by that. We can often come to Genesis expecting to find answers to certain questions that we have, and then read Genesis specifically to find answers for our questions. So things like what happened to the dinosaurs, for example, things like that. And so that doesn't mean that those are bad questions. Like, I'm not making fun of those questions at all. A lot of the questions that we come to Genesis with are really good questions. They're just not necessarily the questions that Genesis is trying to answer. And so rather than coming to Genesis looking for it to answer our questions, we need to come to this book asking, what are the questions that Genesis is intending to answer, and how does it answer those questions? Does that make sense? So those are two obstacles that we're going to have to guard against as we study this book: our past experience of Genesis and our expectations of Genesis. And so that's why it's helpful to take some time before we jump into Genesis 1 to set the stage and get our bearings on what this book is and why it was written. So to do that, what we're going to do this morning is use 5 questions to prepare us and equip us to understand this book as we study it together over the coming weeks. And so 5 questions, you can see these on your handout, 5 questions to begin our study of Genesis. The headings on your handout there are those questions. So number 1, who wrote Genesis? When was Genesis written? Why was Genesis written? How is Genesis designed? And finally, why are we studying Genesis? Like, those are the questions that we're going to walk through together this morning. And the goal this morning then is to answer these questions so that we're ready to study this book together in the weeks ahead. And hopefully then, if you weren't already excited about Genesis, you will be after today. And if you already were, you'll be even more so. That's the goal by the time that we're done this morning. So question number 1, you can see there on your handout, who wrote Genesis? Well, there's a couple of things to get into there to answer that question. One would be that we believe that the Bible is God's word. And so don't want to ignore the reality of God supernaturally and sovereignly revealing himself to us through his word. But he didn't do that, though, in a way where he dictated everything to somebody or dropped a complete written book in their lap. Instead, real people in real settings wrote these words. But God sovereignly worked through those human authors so that what they wrote is both human and divine. And so on one level, though, this is God's word, and that's important to remember as we get into the book of Genesis. But there was also a human author. And so the question is, who was the human author who wrote Genesis? And so it'd be really nice if Genesis 1:1 told us, like the last several books that we have studied together, right? If you remember, Philippians 1:1 told us Paul wrote that. Going before that, Proverbs 1:1 told us these are Proverbs of Solomon. Before that, we did Romans, which was Paul as well, Romans 1:1. And so it'd be really nice if Genesis did the same thing, but it doesn't, unfortunately. And the thing is, nowhere else in the book of Genesis does it tell us either. So we'll have to look outside of Genesis to find out and to look for some clues of who wrote this book. And there's a few different places where we find clues. One is in the books right after Genesis. And so wish we could get into this more this morning, but the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy, actually go together as one unit. Together, they're known as the Pentateuch, which that word basically just means 5-part book. So Genesis is actually volume 1 of the Pentateuch. And so there are 5 separate books in our Bible. Because going back into the history of it, probably they're so long you couldn't really put them all in one scroll, and so they're probably broken up into these 5 scrolls that became the 5 books then that we have in our Bibles. But the point is that when you look through the rest of the Pentateuch, though, there are a couple of places then that refer to Moses as the author, or God telling Moses to write down something that had happened. And so we're not going to look at those for time's sake, but if you want to jot these down to look them up later, you see this in Exodus 17:14, Numbers 33:2, and then Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 9 and 24. In each of those places, Moses is mentioned either as the author of that part or God telling Moses to write down this thing that just happened. And so Moses is mentioned multiple times in the Pentateuch as the author of at least parts of it. Then, when you go further past Deuteronomy into the rest of the Old Testament, we see 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah. Each of them refer to what seems to be those first 5 books, and it refers to them as the book of Moses, which tells us a couple things. One, kind of confirms that idea that they thought of them as one singular unit, and also that they thought of Moses as the primary author. And then you see the same thing in the New Testament as well. It's all over the place in the New Testament. All 4 Gospels, multiple times, Acts, Romans, 2 Corinthians, all of them attribute these books to Moses as well. And Jesus does as well. We'll look at one specific place more later in John 5, but more than once, Jesus points to content from one of the first 5 books and says that Moses said that. So Jesus attributes these books to Moses. So we're not going to argue with Jesus or the rest of the Bible. And so you can see there on your handout that we're going to say that Moses was the primary author of Genesis. So in saying that, like there's some scholars now who would doubt that for a few different reasons. One would be that parts of the Pentateuch seem to come from outside sources. And one would be that parts of the Pentateuch were clearly written after Moses died, like the part at the end of Deuteronomy that describes Moses' death, for example. Like somebody else probably wrote that. But the thing is, neither of those things should bother us. Like a lot of the events in Genesis in particular took place hundreds of years before Moses wrote them down. So it shouldn't bother us that he potentially used oral or even written sources in writing his book. Like that's just part of writing, especially writing history. And it's okay that someone else added the parts about Moses' death and a few other details that would help the original audience of the book after Moses died. That doesn't take away from Moses being the primary author of Genesis or from God supernaturally working through the normal means of writing a book to give us what he wanted us to have in this book. So all that to say, we can say that Moses was the primary author of Genesis. Like that's the answer to the first question. And it's worth spending time on that because it's going to help in the next couple of questions that we ask. So second, when was Genesis written? Well, Genesis doesn't specifically tell us that either. But knowing that Moses was the primary author and knowing that Genesis is part of this 5-part Pentateuch gives us a pretty good idea of when he probably would have written it. And you can see that next on your handout here. Moses probably wrote Genesis during the 40 years Israel wandered in the wilderness. Like, that's almost certainly when he would have written the other 4 books of the Pentateuch based on what's included in those books. And so it makes sense if he would have written Genesis around the same time. So we'll get into this more in just a minute, but it makes sense that Moses would have written these books during those 40 years in the wilderness for a couple of reasons. Like, one, he had plenty of time, probably. Second, just think about the situation at that point. The people had rebelled against God, and so none of the adults are going to be allowed to go into the promised land. And Moses himself had also disobeyed God, and so he wasn't going to be able to go into the promised land either. And so now you have this new generation who would be going into the promised land with a new leader guiding them in. And so it makes sense that Moses, who had been Israel's leader from the beginning, would write all these things down to guide the people and their new leader once he's gone. And so if that's when Moses wrote these books, roughly the timeline on that would be somewhere around 1500 BC. Which means that Genesis is around 3,500 years old now, which is crazy to think about. And it's also important to understand because that means that this is ancient literature. And we can forget that because of our familiarity with so much of Genesis, but Genesis is among the oldest books that exist, which means that we need to understand that Genesis was written in a different language, for one thing, and as well as written from a very different culture from the one that we live in. So it's going to take work to bridge those language and cultural gaps to really understand this book the way the original audience would have. So if Moses wrote this book then during the 40 years Israel was wandering in the wilderness, that means that the original audience was that new generation of Israelites who were younger than 20 when Israel had refused to go into the promised land and had spent the last 40 years wandering in the wilderness. So what would Moses' purpose have been in writing the book of Genesis for them? Which is the third question you can see there on your handout. Why was Genesis written? So to be able to answer this question, we kind of have to try to put ourselves in the shoes of this new generation of Israelites getting closer and closer to the 40 years being up and getting their chance to enter the promised land. Like, what would have been going through their minds? What would have been the questions that they were asking? And just think about their history a little bit. For 400 years, they had been slaves in Egypt. Like, that's a really long time. If you go back 400 years from us today, you go roughly back to when the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower. And in one sense, like, that's so far back, like, we can't even really wrap our minds around what that length of time is like. But also, when you kind of think of that as a point in time, just think about how much the last 400 years have shaped who we are now, whether we realize it or not. And so just think about how, like, those 400 years had obviously shaped them as well. And not just the 400 years of slavery. That time was also 400 years of being surrounded by Egyptian culture, including this entire pantheon of gods and all the mythology that went along with it. So they'd been surrounded by pagan Egyptian accounts of how the world came to be and their role and place in the world. But then God responded to their cries for deliverance and sent Moses to rescue them from slavery in Egypt. And God obliterated the gods of the Egyptians through 10 plagues. And he defeated Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea. And he brought Israel to Mount Sinai, where he came down on the mountain in lightning and thunder and gave them the law, made a covenant with them to be his people. And then they built the tabernacle. And the God that had delivered them from Egypt and spoken to them at Sinai now lived in this tent in the middle of their camp and had been leading them around the wilderness for 40 years. And so I'm 40 years old, which I know puts me in the top few percent of our church age-wise. But for my entire lifetime, or for some of you twice as long as you've been alive, some of you kids 3-4 times as long as you've been alive, they've been following this God around the wilderness as their parents died for refusing to go into the land that God had said he would give them. So that's their history. That's where they've been. And then think about where they're headed. Like, the time is growing closer and closer for these 40 years to be over. And it's finally going to be time for them to enter the promised land. But Moses isn't going to be able to go in with them because he lost his temper and disobeyed God and struck the rock to give water to the people the second time. And so they're going to have a new leader. And they're not just going into some uninhabited land that they're going to be able to just waltz in and start setting up their new lives. Like, no, like the land that God's taking them to is steeped in paganism, just like the land that they had come from. And so they're going to be surrounded by a whole new set of false gods and a whole new set of false origin stories as they take over this land. So given where they come from and where they were going and everything they've been through in between, it makes sense that before they enter the promised land and before Moses hands over the leadership to Joshua, that he would write this book to remind the people who they are. Like, that's why Genesis was written. It was written to tell Israel their origin story. And this is so important for us to understand as we begin this study, because before we can understand what Genesis means for us now, we have to understand what it meant for them then. So this is why Genesis was written, to remind Israel of their origin story, to remind them who they are. And it shouldn't be surprising that Moses would see the importance of knowing your origin story. And just think about Moses' own story. Remember, Pharaoh had decreed that every Hebrew baby boy was to be killed at birth. But Moses' Hebrew mother had hidden him in a basket in the river to save his life. And then Pharaoh's daughter found him and brought him into Pharaoh's palace and raised him as her own child. So Moses had grown up in a pagan palace surrounded by false gods and pagan mythology of the Egyptians. But somehow, probably through his mother that God had sovereignly brought in to be Moses' nurse, Moses had been taught who he was. So he knew that these were not his people. In the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, it says that when Moses grew up, because he knew who he was, Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing instead to be mistreated with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Like, that's the importance of knowing your origin story. Knowing who you are changes how you live. So Moses wrote Genesis to tell Israel their origin story. And what we're going to see is that he wants them to know at least two main things. And you can see these on your handout. First, he wants them to know who is the Lord. Like, who is this God that delivered them from slavery in Egypt, covenanted with them at Sinai, and now dwells with them in the tabernacle? One commentator said when first chosen by God to deliver his people, Moses had asked, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what's his name? Then what shall I tell them? The short answer he was to give them was simply, I am has sent me to you. The long answer was the Pentateuch. That's what this is. Moses wrote Genesis to remind the people of Israel that the God who rescued them from slavery in Egypt is the God who created the heavens and the earth, light and darkness, land and sea, and filled them with the sun and moon and stars, birds, fish, animals, humans, and who rules over it all. Like, that's the God that turned the Nile to blood, that killed the firstborn of Egypt, that brought them through the Red Sea, gave them the law at Sinai. That's the God whose glory filled the tabernacle. That's the God that they offer sacrifices to every day to cover their sin so that this holy God that dwells in their midst doesn't consume them. That's the God that's taking them to the promised land and who's working through them to bless all creation. Which leads to the second thing that Moses wants them to know. That's who the Lord is. That's this God that delivered them from slavery in Egypt and everything else that they'd seen him do. So why them? Like, why Israel? Why, of all people, would God choose to deliver them and make them his special covenant people? That's what Genesis is telling them. Genesis is reminding Israel that they're not just some random people that God stepped in to rescue from oppression. They are descendants of a promised seed. They're heirs to the promises God had made their ancestors. And those promises were part of something even bigger. Like, their biggest problem wasn't their slavery in Egypt, and their greatest need wasn't being rescued from that. Their biggest problem was their original ancestor, Adam, had sinned. And as a result, all of humanity and all of creation now suffers the consequences. But God had mercy on Adam, and instead of killing him on the spot, he made a promise to send a rescuer who would undo what Adam had done. And he chose one family then to be the vehicle of that rescue. So Genesis is reminding Israel that God's covenant with their ancestors and with them is part of God's plan to restore all creation. God rescued Israel out of slavery in Egypt as part of the fulfillment of his promise to work through Israel to rescue everyone and everything from slavery to sin. That's why Israel. But also, in reminding them of God's covenant relationship with their ancestors, Genesis is also warning Israel of the danger of failing to listen to God, to obey God, and to trust God to keep his promises. By sharing the stories of their ancestors, Moses is warning them against repeating the failures of their fathers, which they would have had to see as continuing right down to their own fathers, their parents who had sinned and who are now not allowed to enter into the promised land. And so even in that warning then, Moses is giving them hope, because in spite of the failures of their ancestors over and over and over again, God remained faithful to his promises, which would be really good news for them, because their 40 years in the wilderness had been because of their parents' failures. And they were about to get a new leader because of their leader's failure. And so in reminding them of who they are and the lineage that they're part of, they would see God's faithfulness despite the failures of his people. And it would give them hope as they begin to think about what's ahead for them. So that's why Genesis was written, to remind Israel who God is and who they are, so that they could live like who they are. So then, that leads us to the fourth question. How is Genesis designed? If that's the big picture of what Genesis is about, how does it tell that story? Well, first of all, the title of the book, Genesis, here, it's a word that means beginning, which is a fitting title for this book. We're going to see a lot of beginnings as we go. We're going to see the beginning of the universe, the beginning of humans, the beginning of sin, the beginning of redemption, the beginning of God's chosen people. And the book is designed around all of those beginnings. And so on a smaller level, there's a key phrase that we're going to see 10 times through the book. These are the generations. And that word generations comes from the same root as Genesis, the same root as genealogy as well, which we'll see several of in this book. And so the point is that the phrase, these are the generations, is kind of a heading for each new section of the book. And each one of those is giving us the beginnings of a new thing or a new people. But then those 10 smaller sections come underneath 2 main sections in the book. And there's 5, these are the generation sections in each main section. And so 2 main sections in the book. The first main section runs roughly from Genesis 1 to 11, actually ends in 11:26. And that section gives us the beginning of humanity. And so in that section, we've got the creation account. We've got Adam and Eve, the first humans and their descendants. We've got Noah, who becomes another first human and his descendants. And then the Tower of Babel, which leads to humanity being divided up and spread out over the whole earth. And so the first 11 chapters really function as and lay the foundation for the rest of the story. Then the second main section zooms in and focuses in on one particular person and family line then. And that second main section runs roughly from chapters 12 to 50. It actually picks up in 11:27 and starts out with these are the generation that leads into that section. And that section gives us the beginning of Israel. And so in this section, we've got Abraham and his son Isaac and his son Jacob and his son Joseph and his brothers, who become the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so the narrative slows way down in these last 39 chapters. And so in the first 11 chapters, you've got everything from before time even began through Adam all the way down to Abraham in the first 11 chapters. And then from 12 through 50, the last 39 chapters, you only have 4 generations from Abraham down to his great-grandchildren. And we'll see as we get into those chapters why we slow down and zoom in on them is because this is the chosen family These are the chosen descendants to pass down the covenant relationship with God and the blessings that go along with it, that through them, God intends to bless all humanity and restore what was lost because of Adam's sin, which leads to the overarching pattern that we see throughout the book of Genesis then. We've got two main sections, one overarching pattern. And there's a number of different ways that you could explain this, different words that you could use for each of these different pieces. Here's a few that hopefully kind of give us a sense of what the overall story of the book is. It moves from creation to sin to new creation through covenant. And we see this in a couple of ways. One, this is the overarching story of the whole book of Genesis. It moves from creation in Genesis 1 and 2 to sin in chapter 3 to God's promise and plan to restore creation and bring a new creation through a specific people that he enters into covenant relationship with. And that really starts in the middle of chapter 3 and carries on through the end of the book. We're also going to see, though, that this is a pattern that repeats within the various stories throughout Genesis. So over and over and over again as we go, we're going to see this pattern of sin and the consequences that come from sin, basically leading to the undoing of creation, of a decreation, and then God restoring and renewing and bringing new creation through his covenant promises and because of his covenant promises. And the thing is, then, on a third level, Genesis is ultimately setting that up as the overarching storyline of the entire Bible, that God created the world perfect and humans to live in God's presence and glorify him by ruling on his behalf in his good creation. But then Adam, the first human, as our representative, gave in to the serpent's temptation and rejected God's authority, sought to be God himself. And his sin then brought death and corruption into creation. But God had mercy and promised that he would send another human who would defeat the serpent and undo what Adam had done and begin a new creation free from the effects of Adam's sin. And so the rest of the Bible then is about God working through history to bring us that rescuer who would bring the new creation where his people will dwell with him and glorify him forever. So that's how Genesis is designed. And it's going to be important to keep that in the back of our mind as we go so that we can see all the different parts of Genesis, how they fit into the overarching story of Genesis, how they repeat that pattern over and over, and how they fit into the overall story of the Bible. So that leads us into the final question then. Why are we studying Genesis? In light of everything that we've talked about so far, that's the obvious question, right? Like if Genesis was written 3,500 years ago to tell Israel their origin story, like why in the world should we take however many weeks it's going to take us to get through Genesis to study this book together? Like just because it's interesting history or because there's some good stories in here? Like what's the point of this for us? And it's a great question. And so the first way I would respond to that is to point to what Paul said about the Old Testament in general and the Pentateuch in particular. 1 Corinthians 10:11, Paul says that the things that happened to Israel were written for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. So he's saying that the things from the beginning of the story were written so that we at the end of the story would learn from them. And he says something similar in Romans 15:4. He says that whatever was written in the former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope. So the things that were written from the beginning were not only for the instruction of them and then, but for us and now. And specifically, they were written to give us hope. So here's what all that means for us as we get ready to study Genesis. Like Genesis was Israel's origin story, but Genesis is our origin story too. It's our origin story in part because we're humans, and everything that began was about with humans. Adam as the first human, and everything that follows from there. It's our origin story because we all have Adam as our father as humans. But even more than that, Paul's point in 1 Corinthians and in Romans is that it's our origin story as Christians. Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that Genesis begins. And so as Christians, what that means is we've been adopted into his family. And so through Jesus, these are now our adopted ancestors. That's Paul's point in Galatians 3:7. He says, it's those of faith who are sons of Abraham. So being a descendant of Abraham in the sense of being an heir of the promises that God made to Abraham isn't about being his physical descendant. It's about being his spiritual descendant by faith in Jesus. So if you're a Christian, like this is your origin story in that sense as well. On top of that, as Christians, we can completely relate to what Israel's facing when Moses wrote this book to them, right? Like we are wandering in the wilderness, waiting for Jesus to bring us to the ultimate promised land, his kingdom where we'll live with him forever. In the meantime, just like they were surrounded by false gods and false origin stories, we are surrounded with a culture that's calling us to worship other gods, telling us other origin stories that can all too easily shape us. So we need to be reminded who we are, just like they did, so that we can live like who we are and press on to the promised land. So in light of that, here are 3 primary goals then for us studying Genesis together over the coming weeks. 3 reasons why we're studying this book and what we as elders are praying that God would do in our church through the book of Genesis. First, you can see there we're studying Genesis to learn about God. And this is first for a reason. Like too often we come to Genesis with ourselves in mind. Like I said back at the beginning, to answer the questions that we have for this book, or to teach ourselves lessons for our lives from these characters. And we'll get to those things. But before we get to those things, we need to see how Genesis starts with God. And in so many ways is a story about God and his character and his works. So if we study Genesis and we learn about Adam and Eve and Noah and Abraham and take away all these great lessons from their lives and miss that all of them were who they were because of who God is and God's work in and through them, then we've missed the whole point of this book. So we want to come to Genesis first and foremost to learn about God. Like God is revealing himself to us through this book as the creator who made everything, as the king who rules over everything, as the covenant maker who, when humans rebelled against him and deserved his wrath and judgment, instead showed his mercy and entered into relationship with us to rescue us from our rebellion. And he's revealing himself as the covenant keeper who, when over and over again we were faithless and failed to walk in obedience and faith, he was faithful to his promises and will continue to be. And he's revealing himself as eternal and infinite, holy and righteous and just, but at the same time merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. Oh, my first prayer for us as we study Genesis is that we would see more of who God is through this book. And not just that we would learn about him as an object to be studied, but that we would see him as he reveals himself through this book, and our hearts would be captivated even more by him, that we would love him, and that our worship of him would grow from here to here as we get to know him more deeply through the book of Genesis. So let's read Genesis and study Genesis, looking for God at every turn and for what this book reveals to us about his character and his works. Second, we're studying Genesis to understand the story that we are part of. I've kind of already set this up along the way, but I want to make sure that it's clear here. Like we're not just studying Genesis because it's full of fun stories, but because it's the beginning of the story that we're all part of. And here's why that matters. Philosopher Alistair McIntyre said, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story do I find myself a part. Like the story that you believe you're a part of will shape the choices that you make every day. So if your life is shaped by a story of career success, you'll make choices in line with that story. If your life is shaped by a story of comfort and entertainment, you will make choices in line with that story. if your life is shaped by stories of family or politics or sports, the choices you make will be in line with those stories. And the scary part is we can think that the story of the Bible is the story that we believe we're part of, but our actions show that one of those other stories is actually the primary story that's shaping our lives. So many times over the past few years, as I've struggled with how to respond to different situations personally, or as I've been counseling people on what they need to do in different situations, I've become more and more convinced that what makes the biggest difference is understanding Genesis and the story that it tells us we're a part of and who it tells us we are. Like the stories that shape us answer four main questions. They answer these questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What's the problem? What's the solution? When you think about it, those are the questions that the stories of career success, comfort and entertainment, family, politics, sports, any other story that we believe, they're answering those questions. They're telling us, who are you? Why are you here? What's the problem? What's the solution? And that's what we're going to see in Genesis, is that Genesis answers those questions for us too. First question, who am I? The world around us is telling us all kinds of things ought to define who we are. But Genesis is going to tell us who we ultimately are. And I love, we're going to dig into it in the next few weeks, so we're not going to go there very deeply. But I love the part in the book Prince Caspian and the Chronicles of Narnia where Aslan is explaining to Caspian that he's human and how that both gives him the right to rule, but also all the baggage that comes along with that. And he asks Caspian if he understands, and he says, I do indeed, sir. I was wishing that I came of a more honorable lineage. And Aslan says, you come of the Lord Adam and the Lady Eve. That is both honor enough to erect the head of the poorest beggar and shame enough to bow the shoulders of the greatest emperor on earth. Be content. Like that's what Genesis is going to do. It's going to put us in that category. That's who we are. We come from the Lord Adam and Lady Eve and all that goes along with that. Second question, why am I here? We're going to see that in the next few weeks as well. Why humans were created in the first place. Third question, what's our problem? Again, the world around us is constantly trying to convince us that our problem is any number of things out there. But Genesis is going to show us that our biggest problem is in here for every one of us. That instead of submitting to God as our king, we've rebelled against him. And now we and all of creation are suffering the consequences. And it's our sinful, rebellious, dead hearts that need to be dealt with. Like that's our biggest problem. And we're going to see that all throughout Genesis. And the fourth question, what's the solution? Genesis is going to show us that there's nothing we could do to fix our sin problem, but that God has had mercy on us. And he promised and began a rescue plan that begins in Genesis and carries on through the rest of the Bible. Like that's the story that we're part of. And we have to understand that story so that that story will shape us so that we can live like who we are. Like that's why we're studying Genesis, to understand the story that we're part of. Which leads to the final reason that we're studying Genesis. We're studying Genesis to point us to Jesus. I've touched on this along the way as well. And not to spoil the story, but Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that Genesis begins. So much so that in John 5:46, Jesus says that Moses wrote about him. John 5:46, Jesus says, if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. Like, how can Jesus say that? Moses lived and wrote 1,500 years before Jesus was born. And if you didn't already know, like we're going to see as we go through, Jesus isn't in Genesis. So what in the world is Jesus talking about? What he means is that he's the fulfillment of everything that Genesis points to. We're going to see as we go, that as we study this book together, that Jesus is the true and better Adam who doesn't give in to the temptation of the serpent, but defeats him with the word of God. He's the ultimate seed of the woman whose heel will be bruised, but who will crush the head of the seed of the serpent. He's the ultimate ark that carries us through the floodwaters of God's judgment and brings us into the new creation on the other side. He's the seed of Abraham through whom all the families of the earth will be blessed. He is the lamb that God provides for himself for the burnt offering so that the knife wouldn't come down on us. He is Jacob's ladder that bridges heaven and earth. He's the ultimate Joseph who we rejected and threw into the pit, but who came out the other side and provided salvation for his brothers. Oh, like Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that Genesis begins. And we're going to be pointed to him over and over and over as we study this book. And that's exactly what I was talking about back at the beginning of how by studying the beginning of the story in Genesis, we're going to see more and more depth and richness and beauty in how everything comes together in the end in Jesus. Oh, we want to study Genesis to see Jesus. That's why we're studying this book. To learn about God, have our hearts stirred to worship him, to get to understand the story that we're part of so that we'll live more and more like who we are, and to get pointed to Jesus week after week after week and be reminded of how everything comes together in him and be reminded of everything that we have in him because Moses wrote about him. That's my prayer for us as we study this book. That's why I'm so excited to tear into this book in the weeks ahead. I hope that gets you excited or gets you even more excited than you already were to dive into Genesis 1 next week. I want to close our time this morning by praying these things for us as we begin Genesis. So would you pray with me as we close? Father, thank you for the book of Genesis and how it begins the story that we are all part of. That as we study this book, it's part of the life that we live now. Like these are real people who really lived in real history that leads to us today. And who we are now is what it is because of the things that we're going to study in this book. Where we're headed is what it is because of the things that are in this book. And Lord, you didn't have to do that. You didn't have to reveal these things to us in the way that you have. But in your great mercy and grace, you've given us your word through Moses, through the specific setting that he wrote it in, to that particular people then, but you wrote it for our instruction and so that we would have hope. And so, Father, as we begin the study of this book, help us to understand what it is. Help us to really get our minds around why Moses wrote this book to the people that he wrote it to so that we can understand this book as we study it week by week. But in understanding that, then, Lord, help us to see how it leads to us, that this is our origin story too, that as humans and then ultimately in Jesus, that this is our story. These are our ancestors. This story shapes how we live our lives now. And so, God, would you help us as we study this book to first and foremost to see you underneath everything and around everything, working through everything, that we would see you, that we would see your character, that we would see your works, and that our hearts would be stirred to love you and to worship you. Pray that we would just be blown away by your majesty, your glory, your righteousness, your holiness, your power as we study creation, that we would be overwhelmed with your holiness as we think of our sin and the fall, that we would be overwhelmed with your mercy and your grace as we see your covenant relationship and your promises that you made to rescue us from our sin, and all the ways that you work throughout history in spite of our failures. Father, help us to see you throughout all these stories and to be in awe of you as we study. Father, through this, help us to understand better the story that we're part of, and that story would shape us more and more and more. Father, help us to see how these things that happened thousands of years ago teach us who we are and give us hope for where we're going, and that we would live in light of this story, and that this story would be the primary story that shapes our lives, and all the other stories would fall underneath that. And Father, ultimately point us to Jesus through this book. I pray that we would just see week in and week out how he is the fulfillment of everything that Genesis begins, and that our hearts would be stirred to worship him. Lord, thank you for this book. Thank you for the chance to study it together. Pray that you would shape us individually and as a church through this book in the weeks and the months ahead as we study it together. Make us who you are calling us to be from the beginning through Jesus for your glory, and give us hope as we study this book together. Pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.